Thank you for being here. Really appreciate seeing all of you as the Western Libraries kicks off the 20th anniversary of the Western Libraries reading series. It is quite possibly the longest series of regular programs in the library's long history. For the last 20 years, the series has featured faculty and staff from Western and in a variety of disciplines, interest and subject specialties. Past speakers have included topics in history, sometimes social or local or regional history, journalism, poetry and fiction, writing and analysis, photography, environmental education, you name it, the gamut of our curriculum. We've been really fortunate to host some very, very fascinating programs that showcase the research and interests of so many talented Western faculty. Currently, this is the only library-sponsored recurring event that's devoted exclusively to the creative and scholarly work of our very own Western faculty and staff. Hosting the series helps the libraries connect with faculty, staff, and students from a variety of colleges and disciplines, and gives us an opportunity to publicly express that we want to support and honor the great work of Western's faculty and staff. Making these connections helps us fulfill our organizational mission, which includes connecting people to people, people to place, and people to learning. The series also creates a venue for sharing some of the interesting work done at Western with the larger community, and these events are always free and open to the public. We see a lot of benefit, of course, in sharing these programs online and elsewhere, even after they've taken place. So we place the information about the programs and a video footage of the events in Western Cedar, which is the university's institutional repository. Some of the recordings that we've done, some of the featured speakers within the reading series, air on Bellingham's local community access channel. We're currently working on a list of the various reading series programs that have taken place over the last 20 years, and we can confirm at this point that there's been at least 50 different programs. The series has evolved over time, and we now are committed to having 3 programs each academic year, one in fall, one in winter, and one in spring. I'd like to recognize my colleagues, Western Libraries faculty members, librarians who are planning the reading series this year, Professor Jenny O'Lean, who is in the back, Professor Peter Smith, who is here somewhere, and Professor Elizabeth Stephen, all really talented librarians that are bringing this series to you. And finally, I should have mentioned, I have the honor of being Dean of Libraries. I'm Mark Greenberg. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Peter Smith, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Peter, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Jared Hardesty, today's speaker for the Western Library Reading Series. He is Associate Professor of History at Western Washington University. He is a scholar of colonial America and the Atlantic world, and the histories of labor and slavery. His articles and book reviews have appeared in Early American Studies, Slavery and Abolition, the Journal of Early American History, the William and Mary Quarterly, the New England Quarterly, Itinerario, and Commonplace. Beyond his publications, Hardesty's work has been recognized with grants and fellowships, and he is currently working on a monograph exploring the intersection of labor and empire in the early modern Atlantic world. Please welcome Dr. Jared Hardesty.
Thank you, Peter. Is this echoing too much? I was worried it might echo. Okay, I'm getting the echo. It's okay though. Thank you all for coming here on an afternoon. It's great to see so many undergraduates in the audience to hear about my book and book talk. I have to thank the library. I didn't know I was the inaugural speaker this year for the 20th anniversary for the Western Libraries Reading Series, so that's wonderful. Thank Margaret Fast, our history bibliographer, for inviting me to speak, our bibliographer extraordinaire, as I like to call Margaret. Jenny O'Lean for organizing this and doing all the logistical work, and Mark Greenberg, the Dean of the Libraries, who has proven to be quite the supporter of the history department. He hasn't turned his back on his past as a historian. So it's great to have the support in the history department from our libraries and invitations like this today. So what I want to do today is take about 45 minutes to talk about my recent book entitled Unfreedom, Slavery, Independence in 18th Century Boston. The book came out in April 2016. It will be out in paperback in March, so this would be a very odd thing to say, but don't buy a copy quite yet. Wait for it to come out in paperback, it'll be a little less expensive. Today, I want to do a few things. The first thing, I want to give you kind of an overview of the book, its argument, what I'm trying to do in it, what it does in theory. Second, I want to talk about how I wrote the book, constructed the argument it's making and where that's coming from, take you inside of the process I undertook to write it and to research it. And finally, I want to talk about the implications of the argument I'm making and provide a bit of more of an overview. We don't often think about slavery when we think about New England. We think about slavery, we think about the American South, we think about the Caribbean, but we don't tend to think about the North, and certainly not New England or Boston. And so in a very basic way, this book is the first history of slavery in Boston. There is a longer tradition of studying slavery in New England that goes back to the 1860s. Actually was the first academic history published about slavery in New England. But this is the first history of slavery in Boston. Just to tell you how, for anyone who's thinking about going to graduate school, any of the undergraduates, how deep in the weeds I was in the dissertation when this was a dissertation, then it became my book, is I did not realize, I probably knew it, but it didn't really hit me, the implications of this being the first history of slavery in Boston, until the book was in peer review, when it was being reviewed by the press to be published. So long way from when I actually started the book did I come to realize that this is kind of important to have a book about slavery in 18th century Boston. For that reason, I'll give you a quick overview of what slavery looked like in 18th century Boston. There had been slavery in New England and in Boston since 1638, so just as early as the southern colonies, as the Caribbean. In fact, Massachusetts, where Boston is, was the first colony to openly legalize slavery in the English-speaking world. And there's a law in the books from a 1641 law code legalizing it. By the 18th century, the time period I'm writing on, by 1700, slavery is ingrained into the social fabric and the economy of Boston. And enslaved people will come to comprise about 10 to 15%, I'll talk about why the numbers are a bit wonky here in a bit, 10 to 15% of the population there. They were found in every sector of the economy, from domestic labor, working within households, to industrial labor, shipyards, distilleries. They're found in every sector of the economy, although they did tend to appear more frequently in industrial professions. Most of them were men. About 63% of enslaved Bostonians were men. So slavery just ended in New England. In theory, it ended in 1783, but there's evidence of enslavement in Boston up through the 1790s. So there is a fairly long history from 1638 into the 1790s of slavery existing in Boston. And I was, like I said, I didn't realize this at first, but this was the first history to study slavery exclusively in Boston. The second purpose of this book is that it is an academic monograph. It is a historical monograph, which means it makes an argument about the past. I study primary sources to make an argument about the past. That's what we as academic historians do. And so this is kind of what I have to do stuff like this to keep my job. So what is the argument I'm trying to make in my book? Let me read a bit here. Page 2, right there. Unfreedom uses an early modern transnational lens to examine slavery in 18th century Boston. Rather than the traditional dichotomous conceptions of slavery and freedom, colonial era slavery should be understood as a part of a continuum of unfreedom. In Boston, African slavery existed alongside many other forms of oppression, including indentured servitude, apprenticeship, pauper apprenticeship, and Indian slavery. In this hierarchical, inherently unfree world, slavery must be put in the context of a larger space, a larger world, characterized by a culture of dependence. Unfreedom for enslaved Bostonians, emanating from both their African heritage and New World slavery, shaped their behavior, making them more concerned with everyday treatment and honor than they were with emancipation. By understanding slavery within this context, this study demonstrates not only how African slaves were able to decode their new homeland and shape the terms of their enslavement, but also how marginalized people ingrained themselves in the very fabric of colonial American society. Let me break that down a little bit. It's a bit dense. This is a social and cultural history. The idea was I'm going to study the people who were in 18th century Boston in their everyday lives. More importantly, it's going to study the meaning of slavery in a world that's structured by what I call unfreedom. Unfreedom is not a word, so I apologize for my students for repeating this joke, which I always joke is that one of the few privileges that a PhD confers is you can make up words. And so that's what I did here. I made up a word, historians have also used it, called unfreedom. And what I mean by that is that to live in a world that's more characterized by dependence, that's more characterized by bondage than it was by freedom. If you take a look at the social landscape of 18th century Boston, what you'll find is that about 75 to 80% of the population was bound in one way or the other. Half the population are women. Women fall under the laws of coverture as the responsibility of their husbands or their fathers, unless they're widows. That's about the only way women can find emancipation. So they're bound. The city's labor is heavily dependent upon indentured servants, white indentured servants from Europe. You'll find African slaves, who comprise, like I said, 10 to 15% of the population, but you'll also find Native American servants and slaves in the town as well. That's not to include the many different, more traditional forms of bound labor, apprenticeship, for example. Or in places like Boston, there's also other forms of the modified traditional forms of servitude. So in Boston, for example, they have an institution called pauper apprenticeship that's for poor children. And what happens is, if a child is impoverished, they will be removed from their parents' home and turned into an apprentice and usually turned over to an artisan or a wealthier person to raise them in their household. So what you have is about 75 to 80% of the population in some way bound. This is what's also striking about this, and what struck me as I was researching and writing this, is just how completely normal that was. It was envisioned as natural. This is how you govern society. This is the basis of an orderly and stable society, is to have people bound in these various ways. Some would go so far as to argue that it was a divinely ordained hierarchy. This is what the social order is supposed to look like. Acknowledging these facts, that so many people are bound, society is inherently unfree, at least forced me to reassess what we mean when we discuss slavery. And so that's why I call the interpretive tool I contribute to this argument the continuum of unfreedom. The continuum of unfreedom. Examining slavery, this is defining the continuum of unfreedom. Examining slavery in Boston using this concept allows us to develop a deeper understanding of early modern slavery and the world enslaved people inhabited. In this sense, racial and class boundaries collapsed due to the labor needs of Boston's economy, leaving a large bound laboring class that interacted and intermarried on society's margins. While other scholars have certainly looked at the intersection of race and class in early America, slavery oftentimes stands outside the class system. In a world of unfreedom, however, slavery was an integral part of a divinely ordained hierarchy that structured society and everyday relations. So, in short, I'm trying to attempt to better integrate the history of slavery into the history of social class, to think about how these two interact and how that influences the lives of enslaved people. Too often, slavery tends to be walled off and decontextualized, removed from its social context, from the society that fostered and promoted it. And so what you have here is an inherent tension between class and race in the way in which historians have envisioned slavery and the way in which they've envisioned society in the 18th century. And so I think it's caused historians to overlook how interconnected enslaved people and slavery was to the wider world, how ingrained they became in the social context in which they were living. So I ultimately believe that this, within this context of unfreedom, it allows us to better understand the lived experiences of enslaved Bostonians. And so this is going to give us shape to what I want to say. So how did I come to make this argument? How am I going to recover the lives of enslaved people in Boston? This is no easy task. Many enslaved people in Boston were illiterate. They were denied the right, the privilege of learning to read and write, although many do, as I'll talk about in a bit. But so how do you find their lives? Well, let me talk a little bit about the sources I use. I draw from a wide range of sources: newspapers from 18th century Boston, ecclesiastical records, but most importantly are legal records. I came across this project because I went to Boston College for my PhD, and I was looking for a dissertation topic that would be easily accessible, ability to write it with archives that were local and easy for me to access. And I was talking to one of my graduate advisors, and he's a legal historian. And he told me at the Massachusetts State Archives in Boston, there's a collection called the Suffolk Files, named after the county in which Boston sits. The Suffolk Files is a bit of a misnomer, because it's actually the file papers for the entire colony of Massachusetts, for the court system of the colony of Massachusetts. And so by file papers, this is things like testimonies, depositions, summons, warrants, the types of documents that are attached to legal cases. They're poorly organized. They are numbered chronologically. So they starts with number 1, which is from 1628, and it ends with somewhere in the near 195,000 in the year 1790. So a lot of records, numbered numerically. There are no, it's not very well organized, it's poorly indexed. But, as my advisor told me, he said, look through the indexes that are there. There were indexes created in the 19th century, and for some reason, and I'm still not sure why, whoever indexed them noted every time there was a person of African descent, or a person of native descent, of an Indian, they would note them in the index. They would write, so you would see a reference to, oftentimes their name could be a giveaway, but someone named Cato Freeman, and you'd see parentheses Negro, which was the term used in that time period. And so I was able to use the index in a way that previous scholars and people who had looked at this collection really hadn't. And I was curious about this when I embarked on the research, so I started Googling to see who's using the Suffolk Files, and I think I found 4 or 5 articles from law reviews of people citing documents out of this, but other than that, relatively little access to this collection, very few people using it because of it's so hard to use and so cumbersome in so many ways. But I was able to, luckily, use this index to great effect, and through perusing other sources, through perusing the collection, I was able to find more. I found absolutely fascinating material. I found at least 350 testimonies and depositions of enslaved people talking in various contexts, as witnesses to legal cases, as defendants, as plaintiffs, and so filing lawsuits. And so you hear their words in a very neat way. You hear their voices in a way, in terms of the English-speaking world in the 18th century, there's very, very few sources that allow us to do this. Historians of Latin America are a little more lucky with the Inquisition and things like that. But in the English-speaking world, these records that record slave voices are so rare. And to come across this was really remarkable, and to build a solid collection of them, like I said, about 350, really opened up an interesting world to me. And so, for example, I opened the book, and let me tell you a few of these stories, so the boring stuff's over now, I promise. I opened the book with a story of a man named Jack. And many of these stories really give us access into these folks' backgrounds and who they were and what they were up to. Jack had a really interesting story. Jack lived in Barbados in the Caribbean. His master was a merchant who often hired him out onto ships as a sailor. So he's an experienced sailor. Jack was on a sailing voyage one time from Barbados to St. Christopher in the Caribbean, and he's captured. His ship's captured by a French privateer. There, he's taken to Martinique, and he's sold to work on a sugar plantation. He labored on the sugar plantation for about 3 or 4 years. He's not very clear. This is all his words. And he made some friends, and one night they make a daring escape. They get in a canoe and they row away. And they row, and they row, and they row. And they end up back in St. Christopher, English colony. Jack now effectively has freed himself. He joins the crew of a ship, of a privateer, and he gets his revenge. He goes and they capture a French ship, and they take it back to St. Christopher. And from there, he joins the crew of a ship from New England. And he sails to Boston. And interesting, the testimony, and I couldn't dig up any more evidence of this, Jack mentions that he had been to New England before, and he had been on a New England ship before, so they go to Boston, and the first thing Jack does is he gets off the ship, and he becomes an indentured servant. He signs himself into indentured servitude to a local farmer named Edward Clapp. Clapp was a well-renowned man. And so Jack signed on with him as an indentured servant. And I found this a bit confounding. Here's a guy, he is effectively free. He's liberated himself from Martinique. He's hiring himself out on ship's crews. Why would he, when he gets to Boston, indent himself? And then I started to think about the kind of world that Jack had entered, and he seemed to be familiar with New England. Jack would have been what New Englanders and Bostonians called a stranger, having arrived. He would have had no ties to the local community. He would have been instantly suspect. But by signing on as an indentured servant to Edward Clapp, this gave him connections. It gave him ties to the community. In fact, the moment he signed on with Clapp, he had convinced Clapp that he was a skilled, a skilled craftsman, and Clapp let him go work in Boston on his own. And that's what Jack did. So you hear his voice, you see his story in his testimony that he's offering. The stories can be really fascinating like that of Jack. They could also be really horrific and really get us into the horrors of slavery. And I'll read one of those I found. I don't want slavery in Boston to seem benevolent or kind or somehow less onerous, and I think this story helps get to that. And this is from chapter 3, where I'm discussing master-slave relations in Boston, and I'm using examples from New England as well, and this is an example from outside Boston and New England. A more disturbing example is the New England slave owner named Samuel Johnson, a farmer from York County, which is in modern-day Maine, and Tony, his slave. Tony murdered his master's 5-year-old daughter because the slave had, quote, received several abuses from his master. At first, Tony contemplated suicide to escape cruelty, but he had been taught that, quote, there was no hope of mercy with God for self-murderers. Instead, he considered killing Johnson, or those who had, quote, assisted in tying him while his master beat him, in order to, quote, be brought to justice and be hanged and so get rid of his servitude. Tony finally settled on killing his master's young daughter, Mary, quote, imagining she was more fit to die than the others, and thus, according to Tony, her murder was, quote, less sinful. After planning the murder, Tony went to bed with his clothes on, determined to kill Mary Johnson. The next morning, while it was still dark out, he ran to Mary's room, grabbed the child, ran out the house with her, and threw her down the farm's well. He then ran as fast as he could to the town of York to turn himself into authorities and was later executed. All of those words, all those quotes, that was Tony's deposition from when the authorities in York, Maine were interviewing. You see a man who's been exposed to horrific trauma, who is contemplating the ways to end his servitude, but you also see someone who's been exposed to religion, as he's talking about this fear of sin and of self-murder, of suicide. So these are the types of stories the documents open up. And they're important. They allow us to hear the voices of enslaved Africans, what they thought of the world. Jack and Tony's stories I just told were their own words. These are the men in their own words talking about their lives. And as I mentioned, I found about 350 of these in the Suffolk files. I've been back and been through the collection. I seem to always, now that I know the collection pretty well, I always seem to find more cases involving enslaved people that actually weren't marked in the index. And so there's a lot more there still. After reading so many, patterns began to emerge. And the patterns I was witnessing were not conforming to what I thought I knew about slavery. Enslaved men and women were especially concerned in these documents with grievances and injustices, not abstractions like freedom or emancipation. They deployed language, articulating privileges and rights, and explaining why they engaged in the behavior they engaged in. So they lay claim to rights, they lay claim to privileges that they claim they have. These sources, I started to think about a wider context, about rights, about privileges, obligations, duties, the type of language that kept appearing in these testimonies and depositions. And I had to think back to my work I had done on early modern Europe. My coursework in graduate school I'd done in early modern Europe and early modern Britain especially. And it hit me one day as I was sitting in my office, actually here at Western, as I was trying to think through all this stuff when I was revising the dissertation. And this is kind of what I came to my conclusion. What was going on was a form of what historians would call popular protest. And here's what I have to say. Deeply conservative in nature, these struggles, these protests, did not look to upend the social order, but rather to defend long-standing customs and traditions, usually provoked by changes in labor arrangements, food shortages, increased taxation. These actions were locally focused, untethered from larger ideologies, and sought to establish a mythical status quo in which violated rights would be restored and grievances addressed. Much like angry artisans writing letters of grievance to London newspapers or hungry peasants rioting over the price of flour, enslaved people in Boston utilized weapons of the weak, work stoppages, running away, and even joining large crowd actions such as the famous riot in Boston in 1747, allowed enslaved people to increase their autonomy, ameliorate their condition, and actively reshape the terms of their enslavement, all without necessarily advocating for freedom or an end to slavery. Engaging in these types of protests allowed enslaved Bostonians to find effective ways of bettering their lives and participating in colonial life, all without challenging the social order. So they're not revolutionaries, but they are effective resistors. It taught me have to be careful of imposing our own modern, liberal, small L liberal, ideologies that celebrate human freedom on people who may or may not have believed or known or followed these values. In a world that, and I came to this conclusion, in a world that denied people of African descent were fully human, that were capable of freedom, were capable of taking on the obligations of society, resistance will look more like popular protest and less like freedom struggles. Here's what I say there. Until the American Revolution, resistance to slavery in Boston focused on the fight for autonomy more than legal freedom. Autonomy in this sense meant the possession of a certain degree of independence from the master class, and finding that autonomy through workplace arrangements, the formation of communities and families, the articulation and defense of rights and privileges, and religious affiliation. Enslaved people were largely successful and had a degree of de facto freedom, within slavery of course, that was largely unknown in other parts of the Americas where slavery existed. That is not to say that I'm following an older trope that slavery was more benign in New England than elsewhere. As I try to do in Unfreedom, slavery in Boston was part of a larger system of African slavery, one that had many similarities and differences with other parts of the system, but was still an exploitative institution designed to extract labor from legally unfree people. Benevolence and autonomy, this line of thinking goes, was only sometimes a gift from the master, but was more often demanded and won by the slave. Acknowledging slavery in Boston as part of a larger world of unfreedom forced me to rethink the place of slavery in Boston itself and what that meant for the lives of enslaved people. And so let me talk a little bit about the implications of the research and the argument I'm making. The largest implication that struck me as I was doing the research was just how ingrained enslavement was in 18th century Boston. I was really shocked by this. I had been taught in all my readings of New England slavery, with the exception of a few people, that slavery wasn't important in New England. It was a few rich people who owned enslaved domestics as a form of a status symbol. Who would, they would have their enslaved valets, they would have their enslaved coachmen, their enslaved maids to clean their home as a status symbol to show off their wealth and their power and their privilege. But that's not quite what I found. Rather, I found that the argument about relatively few enslaved people in Boston, the argument about only the wealthy owning slaves, obfuscated reality, especially when we consider Boston as part of a wider world of slavery. Slavery stood at the center of Boston's economy. Boston made its wealth by exporting, by being the port city to export goods, mostly food and dried fish and timber to the West Indies and to fuel the plantation economy there. That's where their wealth came from. That's where how Boston built its wealth. Having such deep ties to the plantation slavery shaped slavery in Boston. So it wasn't just a few wealthy people. I took the time and I read every probate inventory, so the records that are taken when someone dies that enumerates all the things they owned. To read all of those produced in Boston between 1700 and 1775. There are 2,552 of them, if you're wondering. And I found that a quarter of households in Boston between 1700 and 1775 contained slaves in these probate inventories. And that does not include households that sold shortly before the inventory could be taken. It does not include households that hid enslaved people. Enslaved people were considered wealth and taxable property, and so it behooved folks to hide them when the tax collector or the probate court came around. I found that most slave owners in Boston were not wealthy. They were mostly middle class, what we would think of as middle class people, what they call middling people in the 18th century. Artisans, mostly. Blacksmiths, coopers, distillers. which I found really remarkable. It's still a question I struggle with in my mind about what does it mean for a society that it's not wealthy plantation owners who own most of the slaves. It's everyday, it's artisans. And what does that mean to have widespread investment in slavery amongst the middle class? And like I said, it's something I still try to work through in my mind. Slavery was embedded in the town's institutions. I've had the Old North Church in Boston. I've been doing some consulting work with them recently, and so I've been there I did a talk, and I've been there quite a bit. And the Old North Church is the famous church for Paul Revere, the 1F by land, 2F by sea, the Lateran Church, if you know the story. And if you go to the Old North Church, they still have the old 18th-century box pews. And those pews belonged to someone. And at the Old North Church, they have the nameplate of the first owner when the church was built in 1723. So the first owner of the pew on each of these pews, these nameplates, every pew was owned by a slaveholder. Every pew. So here you have an institution, the Old North Church, one church in a town full of many churches where every pew owner in the initial sale of the pews was a slave owner. So deeply ingrained in the institutions. You see ministers in Boston who advocated for the Christianization of enslaved people, bringing them into the churches. So the Anglican churches especially had large numbers of enslaved congregants. So what did this mean for enslaved people? To have a society where slave ownership is fairly widespread, where most slave owners are relatively of modest means, where institutions themselves are deeply tied into and complicit in upholding slavery. Well, it's about, for enslaved people, what I found were really dynamic social worlds for enslaved people. African slaves in Boston were there to work. That's why, and mostly work in industries. And they were mostly, like I said, about 63% men. And so when they're on the job site, the shipyard, the distillery, they're working alongside other bound laborers, indentured servants, apprentices, pauper apprentices, native servants and slaves. And so there's a lot of interaction at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The number of cases, and so in Massachusetts and thus in Boston, it's illegal for whites and blacks to marry, to fornicate. And so the number of cases you find of men of African descent and women of European descent fornicating, of having children. There's a story of Cato, who does not have a last name. Cato's put on trial 3 times because his girlfriend, Mary Goslin, who was a poor indentured woman, had become pregnant. And he's put on trial 3 times for 3 different pregnancies. Every time he is whipped for fornication, she is whipped for fornication, and every time he refused to comply with the law, and said so in the last, we have his deposition from the last case, he refused to comply. So we have, you see a lot of interaction at the bottom of the hierarchy, a lot of solidarity, a lot of working together. In 1747 in Boston, a Royal Navy squadron docked in the port, and a number of sailors took the opportunity to escape. Sailing in this time period for the Royal Navy was pretty awful work. It was military discipline, it was really dangerous, and so some sailors took the opportunity to abscond. For that reason, the admiral in charge of the fleet, Commodore, his name was Charles Knowles, sent what was called the press gang on shore. This was a group of officers who would, impress was the term, would go on shore and capture sailors and take them back on board ships. Of Boston's population, probably about a quarter of the enslaved population were sailors. Of the enslaved men were sailors in Boston. And so the sailors of Boston pour out into the streets. They riot. They seize the press officers and refuse to comply with Charles Knowles' order. And you had white sailors right alongside black sailors. enslaved sailors alongside free sailors resisting the Royal Navy, resisting this change in their laboring condition of being forced to work for the Royal Navy. So they're ingrained, you see this popular protest. You see enslaved people come to be part of the labor market. They're skilled tradesmen many times. As I mentioned, many of the masters were artisans, and they would train their enslaved men to be skilled coopers and blacksmiths and masons. And so they became skilled at the trades, and oftentimes were hired out for days at a time. Sometimes they were allowed to hire themselves out. They also learned how to navigate those institutions where slavery had become so ingrained, especially the law. They learned to use the law. That's why we have such great records. But they also learned how to use the church and churches. They knew that there was a push by Protestant ministers, Anglican, Congregationalist of all faiths, to proselytize to people of African descent, and they're Protestant. And so this emphasized literacy, reading the Bible. Not always writing, but oftentimes reading. And so what emerges is a very literate enslaved population who are going to church and using the church as an institution, and some of them were certainly true believers, but many of them using the institution to learn how to read. And this really changes the social dynamics of the town of Boston, or slavery in Boston. So for example, if you ever read a Boston newspaper, there are advertisements for slaves for sale, for runaway slaves. But the slave for sale advertisements never mention a name. It's always a man or a woman, very vague description, and it always says, "Inquire of the printer." Why? Because they will not publish the names of the enslaved person for sale, because somebody in the slave community can read and could notify. And so this forces certain ways of the institution of slavery to change. You find other little fun details emerging out of this literacy. One of the neatest documents I found was a will left by an enslaved man named Peter Fleet. Peter Fleet belonged to Thomas Fleet, who was a prominent Boston printer. And Fleet actually Fleet had learned how to read, he'd learned how to write, he set type in the workshop, he was an amazing woodblock cut printer, the first historian of printing in the United States. Isaiah Thomas talked about him as an ingenious man who could make these great woodblock cuts. In fact, many of them are still around today. And he left a will. And in that will, he made sure to vouch for his own good nature, his own legitimacy. He promised that all the money he was going to give away in his will, he'd come by through honest means, not through, in his words, roguery. But to really drive his point home, he left money to his master's children. He left money to those who treated him well, and he says this in the will, "You treated me well, so you get this." He's asserting his personhood, his autonomy, and who he was in this will, and he signed it in his own hand. He signed it Peter Fleet. And so enslaved people used the fact they were part of this social fabric to their advantage. This is they use subtle forms of resistance, not open confrontation, looking for autonomy, looking for rights, looking for privileges. And that's where I'd like to end today. And I want to read where I end the book. Sorry, my bookmark slipped on this one. Like the many enslaved people who lived in Boston, this book navigates an unfree society. Using Boston as a case study, it reconceptualizes slavery and freedom in the Atlantic world. Instead of understanding slave action and motivation through a prism of freedom, it eschews modern conceptions of liberty to better understand the lives of the enslaved. The early modern Atlantic was a realm of unfreedom, where universal notions of human freedom and dignity would have been alien. Applying those principles to the past is not only ahistorical, but ultimately wrong. While we certainly cannot know what enslaved Bostonians thought, existing records demonstrate a profound concern with their material conditions and the protection of themselves, their families, and their social networks. The desire to protect those interests suggests that it was these factors that motivate the actions of the enslaved, not abstract, modern notions of liberal notions of freedom and liberty. They were staunch defenders of a set of customary rights they believed they possessed and used any opportunity to reshape and redefine the terms of their enslavement. In a world where freedom could be just as fraught as slavery, the enslaved became masters of their status. Thank you.